Professor Nash has also written produced a number of co-authored and co-edited volumes. He's written more than 20 book chapters, dozens of articles, essays, and reviews. He is a former president of the Organization of American Historians and the recipient of several prestigious fellowships. Historians know this Gary Nash. Familiar with his work. We've all read several of his books, if not all of his books over our careers. And indeed, we've all profited enormously from his contributions to our understanding of revolutionary America, particularly to his efforts to introduce new actors into this transformative period. And thanks in great measure to his work, we can no longer think of the revolution without taking into account such people as the urban poor or the unruly urban poor or African Americans, whether they're enslaved or free people. You know, it's a revolution that now is more fully peopled, in part because of his work. But there's another Gary Nash as well, and one who has come as close as just about any other historian of our time to becoming a household name. And for historians, it's pretty darn hard to do. We don't exactly write these gripping bestsellers. And this is the Gary Nash who has co-chaired the National History Standards Project, or who co-chaired the National History Standards Project from 1992 to 1996, laboring hard to inject his expansionist view of the past into the secondary curriculum. An effort that has fundamentally changed the practice of history education in this country. And this effort to introduce new actors and new narratives into America's classroom has landed him in the middle of an ongoing ideological debate over not only who occupies the past, but who owns the past. And his crime, according to some of the more vociferous of his critics, has been to overly politicize the past. We could talk about that, I guess, what it means to politicize his history. But as the theme of this year's Huggins lectures suggest, Gary Nash is not about to back down from criticism like that. He continues that work of repopulating and consequently rethinking our national history. And this afternoon's lecture, the third of this three-part series, the series is titled African Americans in the Age of Revolution, is a good case in point. Monday's lecture, titled The Black Americans Revolution, focused on Black American struggles to win personal emancipation in parallel with colonial efforts to win political freedom. Yesterday's lecture, that was titled Rethinking the Unthinkable, Could the Founding Fathers Have Abolished Slavery?, challenged conventional understandings of the immediate post-revolutionary period by suggesting that, yes, emancipation was a viable option in those years immediately after the revolution, but one lost on account of leaders who ultimately refused to assault slavery head-on. And this afternoon, Professor Nash will use the political and ideological journeys of two Philadelphians, one black man, one white man, to explore the legacies of that lapse in revolutionary leadership and the rise of competing notions of race and citizenship that in turn would lay the groundwork for an irreparable national fissure, one that finally explodes in civil war in 1861. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Gary Nash here with us this afternoon to examine race, citizenship, and national identity in the early republic. See, I'll get my legs in there.
Oh, it is here, yeah. Well, I am very glad to be here. This is a thrill to be at Harvard and be with all of you. I've had a wonderful time, and sorry I can't stay longer. But I have to go and work with teachers tomorrow. I'll be up bright and early and fly to La Crosse, Wisconsin, where I will spend the afternoon and the evening with high school and middle school teachers. That's my new life. And very, very rewarding. It's something I recommend to every aspiring history professor. Please get involved with teachers earlier than I did. It took me most of my career before I understood the rewards of working with history teachers in the trenches and in the schools. I know it won't get you tenure, so you might want to get tenure first, but after that, do it, because I think we are all part of trying to build a bridge across a shadowy Grand Canyon that had separated professional historians from the teachers of history in the schools. We're all history educators, but we've been on opposite sides of a canyon peering across a vast space at each other. And he's still here. As I argued yesterday, the failure of leadership on the issue of slavery, both in the North and especially in Virginia, deeply compromised the founding principles of the American Revolution. Now, Washington's death in 1799, which triggered an outpouring of adulation for the father of his country, soon brought news that in his will, most of you know this, providing for the freedom of his 146 slaves. His wife brought into the marriage other slaves, dower slaves, which were beyond Washington's reach. And this example provided another opportunity for powerful political leaders such as Jefferson and Madison to return to the purity of the founding documents. But nearly the opposite occurred. 1800 brought Jefferson's presidential victory over John Adams, ushering in a 4-decade era when Jeffersonians dominated the executive and legislative branches of government. Though regarded as the party of the common people, as a party dedicated to to broadening the franchise, to relaxing restrictions on immigrants, on seeking naturalization, and in restoring a state-centered republic, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, also, to use one historian's phrase, extended the domain of white supremacy, unquote. The Virginia Republican dynasty, Rogers Smith tells us, redefined citizenship laws, that eroded the rights of African Americans, and as time went on, in the first quarter of the 19th century, even denied that free people of color were citizens at all. After 1800, Smith writes, quote, citizenship laws increasingly reflected Jeffersonian views of American nationality, unquote, leaving the Federalists, the storybook party of the elite, as the main defenders of black citizenship rights. Thus, a state-centered Jeffersonian republic rendered itself largely incapable of solving what was not a state problem but a national problem. Today I explore how changes in thinking about citizenship and race in the first quarter of the 19th century set the stage for the creation of killing fields through which Americans of all regions, all colors, and all dispositions would have to walk on the road to and through civil war. And I focus particularly, as Susan noted, on the political and ideological journeys of two Philadelphians, one black, the other white, both young men of the Revolutionary era, both longtime residents of the city known as the capital of American humanitarianism. The African American was James Forten, the subject of a wonderful biography by Julie Winch at UMass Boston. Philadelphia's most successful black businessman up to his death in 1841. His 5 published letters to the public in 1813 and other subsequent writings tell us quite a lot about how black Northerners were thinking about citizenship in the critical period leading up to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, to Denmark Vesey's plot in 1822, and to the publication of David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World in 1829. The white Philadelphian was Tench Coxe, C-O-X-E. At first, a shrewd and successful Federalist merchant, and then a longtime Jeffersonian officeholder and leading political economist. Coxe published 2 sets of essays while living only a few blocks from James Forten. one in 1809, one set of essays, the other in the winter of 1820-21. In these essays, Coxe provides us with a figurative roadmap that most white Americans followed in redefining citizenship and national identity in this period when the groundwork for an irreparable national fissure was laid. Forten thought of himself from an early age as thoroughly American. Only as he matured and became successful and then encountered things he never anticipated did he think of himself as African American. In time, he wondered whether being African American would allow those of dark skin to be American at all. Born in 1766 of an African who was one of the first enslaved Pennsylvanians to gate, the grandson rather, of an African who was one of Pennsylvania's first free black people, Forten learned to read and write at the knee of Anthony Benezet, Philadelphia's Quaker reformer who devoted himself to teaching the children of the poor. Forten's father died when the boy was 7. He was 11 when a British officered regiment of black guides and pioneers composed of escaped Virginia slaves who had responded to Dunmore's proclamation occupied Philadelphia in the winter of 1777-78. Forten and his mother no doubt knew what the German Lutheran minister Henry Muhlenberg reported in Philadelphia, quote, that the slaves secretly wished that the British Army might win, for then all Negro slaves will gain their freedom, unquote. The flight of many of the city's slaves to the British in Philadelphia, along with a number of free blacks, could hardly have gone unnoticed to Forten's mother and to the adolescent Forten. But young James Forten would have none of this. Perhaps gaining his optimistic outlook from his free parents and perhaps convinced from Benezet's lessons that Africans were no different than whites in their potential, James, at age 15, signed on as a powder boy on Stephen Decatur's 22-gun Royal Lewis, and thus began a heroic career. For years, Philadelphians would tell of how Forten was the only survivor at his gun station when Decatur's ship dueled with a British warship in 1781, how Forten was captured on the next voyage and into a rotting British prison ship in New York Harbor, how young Forten spurned an offer from a British captain to take him to England as the captain's, as the companion of the captain's son, and how he told the British captain, and this is from a funeral oration at Forten's death, "No, no, I am here a prisoner for the liberties of my country. I never, never shall prove a traitor to her interests." And then how he walked barefoot from New York to Philadelphia. Try walking 90 miles barefoot in winter. In 1783, after the British released their American prisoners, and how after the war he became a valued and successful sailmaker. Forten imagined that the revolutionary generation's rhetoric of natural rights would usher in a biracial democracy in Pennsylvania and create a nation where colorblind national identity flowed simply from an allegiance to the nation and state. Why not? He was a pillar of St. Thomas African Episcopal Church, one of the 2 black churches founded in Philadelphia in 1793. He was homeowner, and he was employer of an interracial crew of 30 sailmakers. He was a friend of notable white Quaker merchants and a confidant of Paul Cuffey, the New Bedford Afro-Indian shipbuilder, merchant, and ship captain who sailed the deep blue seas all the way to Africa. And Forten held before him the preamble of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 that assured him that the doctrine of human equality would be the future if the revolutionary generation remained true to its words. He could read. He kept it always near him. He could read, "All men are born equally free and independent. and have certain natural, inherent, and inalienable rights, unquote. And he had before him the preamble of Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, which also affirmed the unitary nature of humankind, what the legislators called a universal civilization. Here are words from the preamble of the 1780 Emancipation Bill. It is not for us to inquire why in the creation of mankind that the inhabitants of the several parts of the world were distinguished by a difference in feature or complexion. It is sufficient to know that all are the work of an almighty hand, who placed them in their various situations and hath extended equally his care and protection to all, unquote. Forten believed in what a modern scholar of citizenship has claimed was the general presumption of the post-revolutionary period, quote, that membership in civil society was acquired automatically by all those born under the Republic, unquote. But Forten's faith that white Pennsylvanians would honor these commitments began to wear thin by the early Jefferson presidency. Like black and some white Philadelphians, Forten celebrated the slave rebellion in Haiti that began in 1791, which ultimately, as you know, overthrew the brutal French slave regime and established the first black republic in the Americas. And he also had to take the measure of much white northern fear and that of almost all white Southerners that this would spread black rebellion all through America. Forten knew that the refugees from slavery in the South who were filtering into Philadelphia caused white resentment, and how Irish immigrants in the 1790s competed uneasily with free black people for bottom-rung jobs. Forten watched uneasily as Congress rejected petitions from black Philadelphians and the Pennsylvania Abolition Society to rescind the hated Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and abolish the slave trade still flourishing. If the rise of racial hostility in the city of brotherly love shook Forten's belief in one American peoplehood, he was more distressed by an outbreak of racial hostility on July 4th in about 1804 that struck at the notion of free black birthright citizenship. For years, Philadelphians of all classes and colors had gathered behind Independence Hall, where the nation's birth certificate had been signed, to listen to speeches about the blessings of liberty and the prospects of national greatness. But this time, sullen whites drove free black citizens from the festivities with a torrent of curses. At this moment, James Forten's political awakening occurred, perhaps also spurred by Congress's failure in 1804 to pass a bill introduced by a Connecticut delegate that would free black male slaves by their 22nd birthday and female slaves by their 19th, a measure supported in Congress by many Northern Jeffersonians. The worsening situation on the ground in Philadelphia sickened Forten. Black Philadelphians, he wrote, quote, dare not be seen after 12 o'clock in the day upon the field to enjoy the times, without fearing assault from whites, like the destroying hyena or the avaricious wolf, unquote. In allowing white toughs to control public spaces in the city and to drive black Philadelphians from the celebration of nationhood, white political leaders and municipal authorities implicitly renounced the idea that citizenship was the entitlement of all free people regardless of color. Is it not wonderful, Forten exclaimed sarcastically, that the day set apart for the Festival of Liberty should be abused by the advocates of freedom in endeavoring to sully what they profess to adore. Forten's alarm increased as Pennsylvania's legislature began considering bills in 1804, shortly after this July 4th incident, to seal the state off from incoming black migrants, to fasten a special tax on black householders for the support of the poor of their color, to require all free black adults to carry freedom certificates, to sentence those failing to produce a certificate without jury trial to 7 years imprisonment, and to sell into slavery any black person convicted of a property crime in order to compensate the victim. Each of these provisions directly assaulted the principle that citizenship conferred fundamental privileges and immunities without distinction of color. For 9 years, starting in 1804, such bills failed in the legislature. But in 1813, the mayor and city council of Philadelphia supported such bills. And it was at that point that Forten took up his pen. "Search the legends of tyranny and find no precedent," he thundered in 5 published letters. "It has been left for Pennsylvania to raise her ponderous arm against the liberties of the black, whose greatest boast has been that he resided in a state where civil liberty and sacred justice were administered alike to all." Unquote. What had happened to the revolutionary vision of unalienable rights when the founding fathers and the writers of Pennsylvania's Constitution said all men are created equal? Did they mean really only white men? That is what many historians have said ever since. Forten denied this emphatically. "This idea of natural rights," he said, "embraces the Indian and the European, the savage and the saint, the Peruvian and the Laplander, the white man and the African. And whatever measures are adopted subversive of this privilege are in direct violation of the letter and spirit of our Constitution." Unquote. The legislative bills, Forten cried, would convert the center of American benevolence into a center of repression. His words again: "The story will fly from the north to the south, and the advocates of slavery, the traders in human blood, will smile contemptuously at the once boasted moderation and humanity of Pennsylvania." And where, asked Forten, would slaves emancipated in the South go? Quote, "Shut every state against him, and like Pharaoh's kind, drive him into the sea. Is there no spot on earth that will protect him?" Forten's incandescent rhetoric, and I've given you only the briefest snippets, his incandescent rhetoric about universal rights and his attempt to stanch the rising tide of race-based legislation in the early 19th century fed the growing belief of black Americans that the actualization of America as a redeemer nation lay with them, not with whites. We talked a bit about this yesterday. I will return to this point in a moment. Forten's letters to the public, meant to appeal to the conscience of the state's legislators and to the public at large, may have carried weight. In any case, the legislature in 1813 drew back from the patently discriminatory laws aimed at free black Pennsylvanians and all former Southern slaves seeking a new life in Pennsylvania. It was an important victory, but it could not stop the juggernaut of white racial hostility bearing down on free black communities and threatening to pulverize the concept of colorblind citizenship. At first, Tench Coxe, Forten's neighbor, was not part of that juggernaut, but in a few years he began providing a pseudo-intellectual rationale for it. Coxe was famous as one of the most distinguished writers of his generation on American manufacturing, commerce, and political economy. He became secretary of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society after it reorganized in 1787. He was one of the drafters of the first Abolition Society petition to Congress in 1790 to halt the slave trade. In 1796, Coxe moved from the Federalist Party to the Jeffersonian camp, and thereafter he became, in Philadelphia, a Jeffersonian political lieutenant and office holder. All the while, he thought deeply about how the American character came to be distinctive and how the new republic should define citizenship. Coxe's first public comments on this appeared in a series of essays penned in 1809 He called the essays The New World, an inquiry into the national character of the people of the United States of America. Here he spun out a thesis about American uniqueness, one that James Forten welcomed and might well have endorsed. Coxe pictured the Americans as a band of Crusoes who had banished tyranny and ushered in a heroic age of liberty. Greatly to their credit, the Americans, he said, had molded a perfect civil uniformity, unknown and impracticable in any other maritime empire, and highly influential upon the uniformity of the national character. He uses the words uniformity twice in the same sentence. Consistent with his early support for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and he was the secretary at the time the Constitution was written and ratified, Coxe continued, "The white and free black inhabitants are all included in this observation, for it is a truth that the free blacks regularly adopt and display the institutions, the apparel, the furniture, and habits of the whites. They are generally Episcopalians, Calvinists, and Methodists." And now Coxe nailed down his belief in a single human race. Quote, "Man is justly contemplated by our laws and by our political science as an intelligent creation of the divine power. It is known that the highest intellect of the red and black races of men is sensibly better than that of the feeblest of the whites." And from this fundamental belief, end of quote, flowed the notion in Coxe's mind of an unracialized citizenship. Again, his words, "As we cannot discriminate as to rights among the whites by the principle of intellect, the same rule presses itself upon our regard with respect to the free people of the red and black races. Divine providence has ordained the existence of the colored races of men, and we believe and we know that the same supreme authority has ordained humanity and justice among his intelligent and responsible creatures. Our institutions therefore consider all men alike." End of quote. If Forten was pleased in 1809 with Coxe's treatise on the universality of humankind and his insistence that the nation's civil institutions applied equally to free blacks as well as whites, Forten, the black sailmaker, had much to be concerned about in what was issuing from other quarters in Philadelphia simultaneously. Men of science also began discussing American character and race with foreboding conclusions. In a full-scale attack on the environmentalist theory that since the Revolution had dominated thinking about racial differences, mid-Atlantic scientific thinkers now began avowing that irreparable deficiencies in moral and religious reasoning rendered large numbers of Americans useless as parts of the nation's citizenry. Leading the way was Charles Caldwell, who had studied medicine at the University of Pennsylvania under Benjamin Rush, Philadelphia's leading white supporter of African American progress. In two long essays, Caldwell tried to dismantle the environmentalist explanation that any black deficiencies were the results of lifetimes under brutalizing slavery. Here, then, he foreshadowed the rise of the racist antebellum school of anthropology in the United States. First, in his essay on the causes of the variety of complexion and figure in the human species in 1811, and then in 1814 with a similar essay arguing that the differences between races were innate and thus completely resistant to environmental modification. Caldwell's assertion of the inherent inferiority of Africans, a descent into what Bruce Stain, a recent historian, calls irrationalism and narcissistic raptures over whiteness, nearly coincided with Benjamin Rush's death in 1813. as if to punctuate the fact that one chapter of race relations in Philadelphia was ending and another beginning. Here now was the beginning of a polygenesis theory, developed fully in the 1830s by another Philadelphian, Samuel George Morton. The environmentalist line of argument that supported the notion of the indivisibility of the human species, expressed so passionately by James Forten in his 1813 Letters of a Man of Color, was now on the defensive. The rising racial hostility among ordinary white Philadelphians and the strident writing of men such as Caldwell on the inferiority of Africans required Forten and other black leaders to evaluate their situation and rethink their future. As in other northern cities, some free black Philadelphians began to think of themselves as a nation within a nation. If so, it made sense to create alternative celebrations of freedom, especially after their exclusion from white festivities on the 4th of July. In Philadelphia, as in Boston, this began in 1808. January 1, marking the end of the slave trade that year, and also Haiti's Independence Day, since 1804, was becoming an African-American day of commemoration, our day of political jubilee, as one black Philadelphia minister called it. Now black Philadelphians began to parade and celebrate in their own way and on their own day. But they paraded as citizens, even though their entitlement to full citizenship was now under attack. Some historians have detected strains of black nationalism or separatism in the African American celebrations. Yet the urban parades were generally freedom festivals, meant to nurture an African American identity among people generally pursuing assimilationist ends in spite of the spiraling racial hostility. This desire to be fully American was certainly apparent in Philadelphia during the War of 1812, when James Forten chaired a black committee of defense and led more than 1,000 black men in 1814 out of the city to strengthen the Delaware River fortifications, protecting Philadelphia from British naval attacks. If not permitted to shoulder guns, black men stepped forward eagerly with shovels to prove their patriotism and discharge their civic responsibility. But the interclass and interracial harmony that prevailed for a fleeting moment in September 1814, when the shovel brigades, white and black, stood shoulder to shoulder, did not last. A year later, white Philadelphians, claiming to be bothered by the noise of emotional religious services, destroyed a black house of worship in the northern part of Philadelphia. By this time, James Forten was reluctantly concluding that black Americans could achieve peoplehood and nationality only by becoming something other than American. And that something would have to be outside the United States. This, of course, was the position of the American Colonization Society, founded late in 1816, 3 years after Forten's Letters from a Man of Color. The ACS, as I'll call it, was a peculiar mixture of Southerners and Northerners, of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates, of conservatives and liberals. It proposed to purify the nation through the removal of the dark-skinned residents who were free, in effect announcing that America was to be a white man's republic. Black Philadelphians such as James Forten and Richard Allen, minister of Mother Bethel Church, at first believed that emigrationism would be voluntary and occur on black terms, not white. They would shortly change their minds. For black Philadelphians, the question of national identity came to a dramatic head on a cold, wintry night in January 1817. Believing themselves as part of a biracial republic, not yet equal but progressing towards full citizenship, they flocked to a clamorous meeting in the city's main black sanctuary, Richard Allen's African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Bethel. Squeezing his way forward to the pulpit, Forten marveled at 3,000 men packing the main floor, overflowing the U-shaped balcony and spilling into the street. Nearly 3/4 of the city's black men had gathered to speak their minds on citizenship and national identity. Forten had been pondering the meeting of white political leaders who just 3 weeks before in Washington had founded the American Colonization Society and issued statements that repatriating free black Americans to Africa was the only solution to the nation's growing racial problem. Forten thought also of his Rhode Island friend Paul Cuffey, who for more than a decade had been promoting resettlement in Africa, believing that black Americans had no future in the United States. So Forten rose to chair the meeting and to address a sea of dark faces. The man who had staked his identity as an American and had prospered in the city of his birth called on Philadelphia's three most notable black ministers, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and John Gloucester. All three spelled out the advantages of returning to ancestral homelands. Then Forten endorsed the idea, reluctantly admitting that black Americans, as he said, will never become a people until they come out from amongst the white people, unquote. And now came the time for a straw vote. Forten called first for the ayes, those favoring a return to Africa. Not a voice was heard. Not a hand was lifted. Then he called for those opposed. One tremendous no arose, Forten later wrote, as if it would bring down the walls of the building. There was not a soul that was in favor of going to Africa, unquote. This emotional meeting at Mother Bethel in 1817, repeated throughout the nation over the next few years, had an annealing effect on black Americans. The black masses instinctively understood what some of their leaders did not, that while some white ACS leaders were sincere about helping black Americans and others were zealous to send black missionaries to convert all Africans to Christianity, they understood that the colonization scheme was mostly the instrument of Southerners whose main interest was a massive deportation of free black people while providing cover for slavery's expansion. Forten, Allen, and the other black leaders in Philadelphia would dabble in colonization schemes in the future, in Canada and in Haiti, but never again would they speak on behalf of repatriation in Africa. The unanimously endorsed resolution that followed the January evening meeting at Mother Bethel, presented after the vote was taken, hurriedly, expressed a new commitment to abolitionism and racial equality. Here are some words from the resolution. Whereas our ancestors, not of choice, were the first successful cultivators of the wilds of America, we, their descendants, feel ourselves entitled to participate in the blessings of her luxuriant soil, which their blood and sweat manured, unquote. Again, referring to the founding documents on which common citizenship was based, the black Philadelphians avowed, here are their words again, that any measure having the tendency to banish us from her bosom would not only be cruel, but in direct violation of those principles which have been the boast of the Republic. These are almost certainly the words of Richard Allen and James Forten. Now let's turn back to Tench Coxe, and we're still in 1817. Well, Coxe must by this time have wished that the black masses of Philadelphia had opted for immigration to West Africa. The Deep Depression that followed the end of the War of 1812, the most serious depression ever experienced in the northern cities to that point, may have shattered his earlier optimism about the assimilation of free black people and their potential as respectable citizens. Or had he fallen in line with the Jeffersonian faith in state-centered democracy, which was leading toward restrictions on black citizenship? Or had Philadelphia's white working men, who formed the Jeffersonian Party spine, changed his mind as they grew increasingly rabid on race issues? Whatever the causes, Coxe reversed course, now viewing free African Americans concentrated in northern cities as an impoverished, uneducated mass for whom the rights of full citizenship were inappropriate. But if free black people were to become a pariah group, how could their exclusion be squared with the avowed principles of colorblind citizenship that had prevailed for nearly half a century? Founding members of the American Colonization Society, which included some of the nation's most admired political leaders and thinkers, were constructing an answer. At the ACS's first meeting, Henry Clay had argued that the free black people were, quote, a useless and pernicious, if not dangerous, portion of the nation's population, unquote. Others knew that these gloomy characterizations promoted a fractured American identity. In following up on Clay's initial address, Elias Boudinot Caldwell, scion of a wealthy New Jersey family and clerk of the U.S. Supreme Court, brooded about this and brooded about taking such a momentous step. He quoted the Founding Fathers' axiom that all men are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, and he warned that the ACS was leading a cause ready to deny that all free Americans acquired citizenship by birthright. But having said that, Caldwell stumbled. Regrettably, he confessed white hatred of black Americans made it impossible that, quote, they can ever be placed upon this equality or admitted to the enjoyment of these inalienable rights while they remain mixed with us, unquote. Again, his words, some persons may declaim and call it prejudice, but no matter. Prejudice is as powerful a motive and will as certainly exclude them as the soundest reason, unquote. Removing black Americans rather than removing white prejudice was winning the day. Bowing to popular feeling rather than seeking to change it became the choice of leading white figures. The task of finding a rationale for denying citizenship to free black Americans without sacrificing principles to prejudice captured Tench Coxe's attention in 1820. Could he find a theoretically consistent way to deny free black people the rights and privileges of citizens? This was precisely the question raised in Congress when the admission of the Missouri Territory to the Union as a slave state became a fiery, deeply divisive, and destabilizing issue. Slavery, the pro-Southern argument went, had to be protected to preserve the nation's unity. In fact, however, a North-South unity purchased through the expansion of slavery into the Western territories was a tenuous, in fact, counterfeit unity, a ticking time bomb of sectional tension. By March 1820, Congress had decided it did not have the power to forbid slavery in a state applying for entry into the Union. But by admitting Maine as a free state, while Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, Congress maintained sectional parity in the Senate. And Congress hoped to settle the issue by drawing the famous Missouri Compromise line through the rest of the Louisiana Territory at 36 degrees 30 minutes, a fateful marker for defining slave and free territory in the future. But on the heels of the compromise, the less known Second Missouri Compromise was the Missouri Constitution passed in St. Louis in July 1820 that forbid the entry of free black Americans into the new state. Many Northern congressmen strongly objected to this denial of a prime citizenship right of free movement. Southerners vigorously defended the offending clause, denying explicitly that free blacks in the United States were citizens. This is the first explicit statement of this sort. And it brought the entire question about black citizenship to a head, investing it with tremendous political and ideological significance. If Congress supported the Southern position that free black people were not citizens, this was the position that the Supreme Court avowed 40 years later in the Dred Scott case. But we're back in 1820. Then free black adults in the North, as many Northern congressmen pointed out, would be vulnerable to losing the right to move freely and also to acquire property, worship freely, and correlatively would be relieved of their obligation to pay taxes and defend their country. Pennsylvania's representative in Congress, Joseph Hemphill, put it bluntly, quote, "If being a native and free-born and of parents belonging to no other nation or tribe does not constitute a citizen of this country, I am at a loss to know in which manner citizenship is acquired at birth," unquote. Senator Morrill of New Jersey argued that if Congress endorsed Missouri's Constitution, making a distinction between citizens simply on the basis of color, then the precedent would be set for every state to grant or withhold rights similarly. In this case, he said, your national existence is lost. The Union is destroyed, the objects of confederation annihilated, and your political fabric demolished. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams agreed that the Missouri Constitutional Clause forbidding the entry of free black people into the new state would strip thousands of citizens of constitutionally guaranteed rights. Adams' words, already cursed by the mere color of skin, already doomed by their complexion to drudge in the lowest offices of society, excluded by their color from all the refined enjoyments of life accessible to others, this barbarous article deprives them of the little remnant of right yet left them, their rights as citizens and as men, unquote. The Southern response came with withering facts at their disposal. Every day of the week, they said, Northern states discriminated against free black men and women. Every day of the week, they were denied full equality. And so free black people were not, in fact, citizens, and were not treated so throughout much of the North. Especially, Southerners argued, emancipated slaves were not free-born and were therefore incapable of acquiring citizenship simply because their masters relinquished claims to their labor. Into the midst of this heated argument over whether free black Americans were citizens, aliens, residents, or something else, Tench Coxe, writing at a blistering pace, submitted 13 essays to the Philadelphia newspaper most popular among Jeffersonian working men and shopkeepers, the Democratic Press. Coxe titled the essays, Considerations Respecting the Helots of the United States, African and Indian, Native and Alien, and their descendants of the whole and mixed blood. This was a tip-off, since helots, H-E-L-O-T-S, referred to a class of serfs in ancient Sparta who were neither slaves nor citizens. At the heart of his essays, Coxe argued that free black Americans, Indians, and all other people of mixed blood had never been considered a part of the social compact before the American Revolution, and that in the Declaration of Independence and the state constitutions passed thereafter had never been admitted to the rights of citizenship. But this was a blatant disavowal of what he'd argued in 1809. He did not relinquish in these new essays the idea that slavery must end at some time in the future, and he was critical of northern states and cities for crippling the chances of free black people by denying them public education. But while hedging this hint that free black Americans were potentially worthy, he argued that the helots of America were descended from, in his words, uncivilized or wild men without our moral sense, or our notions of moral character, a people not yet evinced by the actual facts to be capable of genuine modern civilization. Are we all willing to give them the whole substance of the liberty wherewith heaven has made us free? He asked rhetorically. Or are the helot people deemed unworthy to be made as consummately free citizens as ourselves? Or are they considered incapable of attaining the characteristics, moral and intellectual, which belong to the least qualified portion of the white citizens in the states, which admit to suffrage and office all but paupers and insane persons, unquote. It was with this language that Coxe turned his back on the environmentalist beliefs subscribed to by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and aligned himself with the speculations about biological inferiority that Jefferson had spun out in his notes on Virginia a quarter century before. Choosing the loaded word helot to punctuate his essays, he joined the new pseudoscience school to revive the old views of how black people of purported savage backgrounds could never overcome immutable traits that made them forever unsuitable for citizenship. Thus, it was right, Coxe pronounced, that they were, quote, excluded from the rights, qualities, and character of citizens, unquote. Free black Americans, he said, would have to be removed to a new Africa, somewhere in the remote West, where they would be policed, reservation style, by the federal government. Those still enslaved must remain so, because injecting additional innately and incapable men and women into Southern communities as free people would bring on, and here he gets into the kind of language that we associate with a later period of history, would bring on, quote, the horror of a helot convulsion and the prostration of everything from the cradle of the infant to the couch of age to the bed of virgin purity and the half-sacred connubial chamber, unquote. I mean, this is the language of race fear, of blood mixing, of any kind of interraciality, denying the whole concept of all one blood. Cox's biographer, Jacob Cook, calls this a defense of slavery, quote, that not even Southern hardliners could have bettered, unquote. Why did Tench Coxe beat such a rapid retreat from his earlier position on free black citizenship? How came it? His biographer puts it, that, quote, he had only to contemplate fleetingly the notion of racial equality to be thrown into frenzied terror, unquote. By Cox's own account, it was the wretched condition of African Americans in the northern cities that had, in his words, raised in the most favorable minds fears that even gradual emancipation has lost much of its supposed facility among men who consider the present and probable results of that interesting operation, unquote. Given the condition of free black Northerners and the unwillingness of whites to educate them, he argued, black people must be bound to obey the exclusive legislative authority of the white people, unquote. Yet Cox's change of attitude toward black capability and entitlement to citizenship occurred precisely during the years when African American churches and schools and mutual aid associations and literary societies had built the foundations for a respectable black citizenry. And Coxe had witnessed and welcomed, along with all Philadelphians, the shovel brigades of black, Irish, German, and other Philadelphians who had marched out of town at the height of the War of 1812 to protect the city against an attacking British Navy. And Coxe also knew what the census of 1820 was revealing, that among Philadelphia's 2,000 black householders, about 1 in 8 was a property owner, and many had achieved middle-class status, some of them his close neighbors. Was it deliberate self-deception that led Coxe to argue that giving free black people full citizenship was misguided benevolence? Because it would, in his words, render the unfortunate black people objects of endless litigations, awful terrors, and fatal injuries? The origins of Coxe's stunning turnabout are multiple, and I'm still trying to sort them out. Certainly this turnabout partakes of the American colonization society's rise and its embrace by many white Philadelphians, including many of Coxe's friends and even some members of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. In a few short years, the ACS had crystallized the latent feeling in white churches, in white salon life, and in the counting houses of Philadelphia that black people were unassimilable either because of innate inferiority or because of white prejudice. Coxe's essays on the American helots dovetailed neatly with the ACS's arguments. His reversal of a deeply held commitment to racial equality also jives with the analysis of Roger Smith, who shows how Northern industrial development altered ideas of citizenship. The slave produced cotton from the South that set the spinning wheels of the North's textile factories humming, put a premium on men such as Coxe to change their views. Smith reasons to assuage their liberal consciences, white Americans began elaborating defenses of their civic inequalities, buttressed by pseudo-scientific enlightenment and Protestant religious doctrines of racial and cultural superiority. In so doing, they attacked white supremacist qualifications onto a basically Lockean understanding of American political identity, unquote. When a Jacksonian senator from Ohio in 1839 thundered, "The slave power of the South and the banking power of the North are now uniting to rule the country," he echoed the newly adopted rhetorical stance of Tench Coxe, staunch Jeffersonian, as the essays were published in 1820. I know of no way to measure the exact effect of Coxe's essays, but surely they fed, to some degree, greater or smaller, the tide of anti-black sentiment coursing through James Forten's Philadelphia and throughout the North. 1 year after Coxe's essays appeared, New York's legislature imposed a race-specific property qualification only for those who were black that disenfranchised most black men, free black men. Within a few more years, white marauders in Boston, New Haven, and Pittsburgh attacked the most tangible markers of free black accomplishment and respectability: African American churches and the homes of successful black urban dwellers. In 1829, whites attacked black churches and neighborhoods in Philadelphia and Cincinnati. In 1831, Philadelphia's leading Quaker reformer, Robert Svo, wrote discouragingly, quote, "The policy and power of the national and state government are against free black people. The popular feeling is against them. The interests of our citizens are against them. The compassion once cherished toward them in the commonwealths which got rid of slavery or which were never disfigured by it appears to be exhausted. Their prospects, either as free or bondmen, are dreary and comfortless." And the way was paved now for Pennsylvania's Constitutional Convention in 1837-38, which, as in most northern states, conferred universal white manhood suffrage, expanding the suffrage for white men for the first time while stripping black men completely of their vote. It was under this new definition of color-coded citizenship that thousands of black Pennsylvanians fought for the Union a quarter century later. Though Coxe's essays fed the virulent pro-slavery white supremacist campaign and contributed indirectly to the Southern slave-owning power in Congress, such literary productions spurred black organization, self-expression, and militancy. Free black Americans were not going to take this line down. After 1820, they knew for a certainty that they faced a cruel double paradox. First, with slavery and blackness no longer quite synonymous, they understood that white Northerners were placing a premium on racial demarcation. And second, they understood that the more free black people achieved in building churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, the more white people resented these institutions. There is a pattern that runs through the race riots of the northern cities from the first decade of the 19th century right down to the 1840s. Almost without exception, the first targets are black churches and the homes of the most successful black people. But let us remember that resolving paradoxes is often the work of those who suffer its inequities and wounds. Civic-mindedness and moral rectitude, the earnests of good citizenship among black leaders, now counted for little, they understood. And yet, this proved to be a watershed. Now black Americans had to channel disappointment into mobilization, where improvisation had to replace reliance on sweeping, clear-cut principles derived from the nation's founding documents. Before 1820, the black preacher was, to use the words of W.B. Du Bois, quote, the most unique personality developed by the Negro on American soil, unquote. But now, after 1820, it was the secular leader, defiant rather than moderate, politically more than morally attuned, who stepped forward center stage as a race-proud man. Within a few years of Coxe's death in 1824, the first black newspaper in the United States, Freedom's Journal, was launched and began to promote a new era of black political consciousness and intercity organization, all fueled by a growing stream of speeches, sermons, and proceedings from intercity black conventions that began in 1830. James Forten, now in his sunset years, in his 60s, became ever more active, making an early contribution to Freedom's Journal with an indictment of Henry Clay's dishonesty in pretending to be the friend of oppressed black Americans when his real intention in promoting the American Colonization Society was to rid the South of free black people whose presence threatened slavery. In 1829, in Boston, David Walker published his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, which emboldened free black citizens to challenge white arguments, such as those published by Coxe, and to take the position that entrenched white Christian hypocrisy left black Americans the job of redeeming the nation's sins. Walker's Volume of Fire, as it was called, not only called for black Americans, in his words, to think and feel and act as one solid body, but to think of themselves as God's chosen people, whose resistance to slavery and white discrimination was divinely sanctioned. 2 years later, after David Walker's appeal, William Lloyd Garrison launched his fiery abolitionist paper, The Liberator. And how was the first issue paid for? Through a contribution of James Forten, who sent the money for 27 subscriptions. This bought the ream of paper for the first issue. And in the first month of publication, Forten contributed an essay attacking colonization as a malevolent scheme, based on the notion, in his words, that a black man is an alien to the country in which he was born. Forten carried on his struggle for another decade before dying in 1841, believing to the end, in his words, to separate the blacks from the whites is as impossible as to bail out the Delaware River with a bucket, unquote. Of course, white legislators were able to separate black and white Americans in civil and legal terms by compromising the Founding Fathers' belief in birthright citizenship. But James Forten, black citizen and patriot of the revolutionary generation, passed the torch to a new generation of black leaders who occupied the anomalous status of free non-citizens in a white man's country. Yet free black Americans could never be socially, economically, physically, or ideologically severed from the white citizenry. A people within a people, perhaps, a nation within a nation, but nonetheless Americans. Thank you.
Construction of identity of this new Anglo-American with political and cultural and social rights, that it was almost necessary for there to be the presence of African slaves in order to help define and shape what that Anglo-American's rights look like. In other words, it's a simple thesis that in order to understand what you are, you must also understand what you are not. And so in some ways that the presence of those Africans and the very systematic and legislative way in which the disfranchisement and the de-articulation of rights is ascribed to them is almost propping up a description of what the rights for these Anglo-Americans looks like. Can someone advance a thesis like that?
Well, you certainly can advance that thesis. And 1 week after our latest quadrennial election, perhaps you were saying that things have to get worse before they get better. I think that perhaps is what I'm hearing here. And that is what I was trying to say at the end. Out of this disappointment in Forten's life course, Forten became more and more activist as he got older and older. And as he had to find the way of redefining himself. But the annealing power of disappointment and frustration and suffering. Yeah, I think he certainly was.
You mentioned Coxe. He started out as an abolitionist, and then he reverted and started writing these racist essays. And you also mentioned that he had been involved with industry or business.
Yeah.
And I wonder, because as I try to do research, I try to find the financial threats of slavery and so forth, not only white prejudice. Was his business situation, you mentioned the deep depression, was all of this transpiring or intermixing there?
Yes, I only touched on it momentarily, but had been through an incredibly wrenching depression that began in 1816 with the end of the war and would continue until about 1823. This is the first time there were soup kitchens in the northern cities. So that's part of it. And the other part is whether the southern cotton flowing north through the textile mills was just at the beginning stage. But sometimes, and perhaps he was prescient in picking up on this. But the textile mills in Lowell, and then in Manayunk, in Philadelphia, and Rockdale, but they were in the very early stages. They would gather an awful lot of momentum later in the 20s and be roaring full scale in the 1830s. So we're at the leading edge of this wave. And that's what I've been trying to figure out, just how much that was behind this shift, where he flatly just turns his back on everything he expressed so eloquently just a few years before.
Yes, that mine is, I guess, another aspect of the question. I think is why this shift from more egalitarian approach by the founders fighting the revolution switched so that there was, this growing racism. And you mentioned the Depression. Is there anything else beyond Coxe's own case, the broader anti-black, anti-free black racism in the North? What would you attribute it to beyond the Depression?
Some other factor
anything
that
else?
gets twisted into this. Well, Pennsylvania is the southernmost northern state. It shares a border with Maryland and Virginia. And so it is across that Mason-Dixon line that either escaped slaves or free black Southerners come as they head north. So following the North Star leads directly to Philadelphia. And white Philadelphians see substantial numbers of free black people. Now, it's not true that the black population is growing as a percentage of Philadelphia's population. In fact, it's declining. The numbers, the raw numbers are increasing, yes, but the white numbers through immigration and natural growth are growing faster. And yet, there is a lot in the newspaper about this this menace of so many black people in the city. It's not so easy to get inside Tench Coxe's mind to see how all of this gets configured, how his brain gets rewired as he moves from one set of essays in 1809 to another set, almost diametrically opposed in 1820. But in a way, he is following the course of the white population in general. In fact,
you talk about different sort of challenges to citizenship in the early 19th century. Citizenship was defined ultimately by birth in the 14th Amendment, and then essentially defined away with the Dred. Well, it was defined away by the Dred Scott decision, and then it was defined again by the 14th Amendment at the end of the war. How can you generalize in the early 19th century about what made a citizen, and how should that apply to black people, both slaves and free black people? And essentially, I'm asking you to take the strands of what you described and see if there can be a generalization.
well, Roger Smith has got a big book on this called Civic Ideals. Anything I say simply expresses a debt to this very fat volume. But he is trying to follow as precisely as he can changing notions of citizenship as you move from the Revolution to the late 19th century. But I have not really followed this story forward from the 1820s. And I'm far from an expert on this after that period. But I think I'm arguing that by 1820, there had been this very, very major shift, and it all came to a head in this fiery debate over Missouri's Constitution. I mean, what I didn't say, I don't know whether you know the outcome of that debate over the Missouri's Constitution, which denied free black people entry to the state. But it it ends up, the Constitution gets put on the shelf, at least for a short period of time. It's like a stalemate. Congress, the sentiment in Congress was that this can't be allowed. This Constitution will tear the fabric, the constitutional fabric, and this whole concept of citizenship. So they put it on the shelf, and it's like a cooling off period. Then when the Missouri legislature reconvenes, they do push it through, and Congress stands down. They don't take up the debate again. So through doing nothing, in the end, they lose that cause. Yes, sir.
The same question of why the change in Cox's thinking, and more broadly, why this sort of turn never taken for emancipation. I was struck in the essay where Coxe sort of calms out as a polygenesis, as you describe it, by the analogies to Native Americans. You talk, I think there were words of an Indian nation, you even mentioned a tribe, in reference to both blacks and Native peoples, as well as, and then in your own closing comments, you talk about a nation among nations, which seems to refer to the ultimate, or the now consequence of imperial push westward. Yesterday, you talked about the possibility of compensation of slave owners through the sort of forced sale of native lands, and it begs the question of how the problem of imperializing native nations affected the inability of Americans to take this emancipatory course.
Well, you correctly point to a missing piece of my argument. And I have to go back and read these essays more carefully. They end up to a lot of words. He really piles up words, these 13 essays. And then he writes another shorter set of them, a set called To the Negroes of the United States, which I didn't have room to include in this. But I have to go back on the Indian question, because it's right in the title there. He's talking about Africans, about Indians, any people of mixed blood, and how this gets connected to what's going on in this very complicated attempt to what I call the war of national expansion. My argument would be that the American Revolution does not end in 1783 when you get peace treaty with the British, because the war continues as a war of national expansion against the interior Indian nations. And that's a war that really ends, and then only temporarily, in 1795 with the Treaty of Greenville, by which time the whole Ohio Valley is now in American hands. And then, of course, the whole Indian dimension of the War of 1812, which is also an Indian war, not just a war between the Brits and the Americans. And how all that figures into Cox's thinking, and why he includes Indians in this, when they don't yet, they are not yet thinking of themselves, I don't believe, as citizens who want to vote or hold office. So that is a missing piece that worked for the future.
Polygenesis seems to provide a sort of retroactive logic for the treatment of Native peoples as sort of a separate thing in the years following the Revolutionary Wars.
There are interesting hints of it. When the Continental Congress was trying to bring the major Indian nations in on their side, and most were tilting toward the British, the Continental Congress actually told the Delaware people that they would be admitted as a 14th state and conferred full rights of citizenship. As it turned out, that didn't work. The Delaware people went with the British after a couple of very awful a massacre of innocent Delawares, Christian people, the massacre of Nod and Hutton. But That we know very little about, but the idea that Indian people, well, there are, of course, Jefferson had promised even during his presidency to visiting Indian chiefs in Washington, where he said their blood would mingle with that of the white people, and we would be an Indian white united American people.
This is a way, perhaps, to be able to accommodate this larger story.
Well, this is a lovely thing about coming to a place like Harvard. And we get into the Q&A, and I go home with a whole new research agenda, and clear the cobwebs out of my tired head, and go at it afresh. Jeffrey?
Yes, well, I was just saying that it seems like the sort of movement, what you're suggesting, that the sequence, I think, is probably really important. Because it seems to me that Jefferson does really make a major distinction between Indians and blacks in Northern Virginia. And that Coxe then is breaking with Jefferson at the same time that he's breaking with his former abolitionist position, because Jefferson always held out that, well, you know, if they allow themselves to be absorbed, and, you know, the whole thing of having a language, and the whole thing that leads down to the whole Cherokee situation. But it seems like this turn against blacks as not being citizens seems to perceive that, at least, you know, at least in the way in which you were laying it out. It seems to be that the turnabout, you know, that the focus on black non-citizenship occurs, as you suggest, right after the War of 1812 and in connection with that Depression. So it seems like they come together in Coxe, but they seem to have slightly different trajectories about attitudes towards blacks and Indians.
Well, you know, he talks on several occasions about his fear of a servile insurrection, and yet it's not always clear whether he's thinking he has plenty of experience with Indian wars and with black insurrections, but they seem to get mingled and confused in
I guess
his
the element
mind.
I'm thinking is not really there is working class white people as potential sources of insurrection, which we see in the earlier, you know, 17th century. It's bound up with, you know, large numbers of free whites that are bonding with blacks and leaving the colony and then attacking the colony. You know, I wonder whether there is this mixing, not so much of native and black people as insurrection, but in Philadelphia, in that depression, if there's not mixing of poor blacks and poor whites,
well, there is. That's right.
Become a threat. So
Yes.
the mixing part has this sort of intra-racial class.
Yes. Well, I do have one section that I left out for purposes of time, but it will show up where ministers who had married people interracially before now begin to turn away interracial couples who are seeking church marriage. And Emma Lapsansky, one of my co-authors in the African American Lives, has written a wonderful book. Her dissertation was about one part of Gaskell Street, a neighborhood in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, where white and black, Irish and black, German and black people were living together, side by side on streets, often in the same house. We're way before a housing segregation. We're long before that. It was a very close intermingling of people. And James Forten has done work of this sort too with some of the communities north of Philadelphia, Boston and New York, state communities. Yes, sir.
I think you said that at the 1817 meeting at Mother Bethel in Philadelphia that all three leaders, including Forten and Allen, spoke in favor of a Back to Africa agenda which the populace rejected suddenly. How do you explain that gap? And is it possible that those leaders had been influenced by former abolitionists like Coxe to take that compromising position?
Well, I think Paul Cuppy, they were friends of Paul Cuppy, and they were thinking of him partially. He had been advocating it for some years before that. He hadn't had much success, he had tried in Philadelphia to recruit people to go back to Sierra Leone on his ship. Only a handful, this is before 1817, had joined Cuppy in 1811 and 12. But it surprises me some because Allen and Webster, who were ministers, that they were either stepping way out in front of their flock, or they somehow weren't hearing their flock. I'm not sure whether they were a bit out of touch with what their parishioners believed, or it's not easy for me to understand why all of the three leading black ministers in front of this great mass of people, crowding Mother Bethel, would all speak in favor of the American Colonization Society program, which was only 3 weeks old, so it hadn't been fully articulated, but the germ of it was already out there.
With regard to the burning of the churches and the homes of prominent African Americans, who were the primary people doing it? Was it, can you break it down into poorer whites, middle-class whites, or was it just sort of a generalized resentment? Can you characterize the perpetrators in any way? Is it possible?
It's very, I would say generally it's lower-class people, but when one has to be careful. We're a little handicapped in this since no one was arrested or indicted. So the court records are silent on it, and no one goes brought to court on this. But just working from these very brief newspaper accounts sounds like a mob of whites. But later in the 1830s, we have books on Jacksonian laws, which suggest that it wasn't just white people in the bottom rungs, but people on up into the middle.
$1.06 and people want some food.
I think we're warning you. Thank you very much.